Once upon a time, in the grand city of Colossae, a young slave named Onesimus lived under the household of a powerful Roman master named Philemon. Onesimus had spent his life in service, obeying commands, fulfilling duties, and knowing one thing above all else: he was not free. The stone walls of Philemon's house loomed large, its halls filled with the sounds of orders being given, feet shuffling, and the occasional snap of a whip when a servant moved too slowly. Onesimus had learned to survive in such a world. He had learned when to speak, when to stay silent, and most of all, when to dream of something more. Because deep in his heart, buried beneath years of servitude, Onesimus had a secret. He longed to be free. One evening, as he scrubbed the marble floor of the inner courtyard, he overheard Philemon speaking with a guest. The name Paul was mentioned, a preacher, a man who spoke of some new way of life, of a God who did not see men as slaves but as brothers. Onesimus paused, his hands tightening around the wet cloth. What kind of God would see a man like him as an equal? He shook the thought away. It didn't matter. Nothing changed the truth. He was bound to Philemon, just as he had always been. But the thought lingered. It followed him in his work. It echoed in his mind at night. And when the opportunity came, when he found himself with enough silver to slip away unnoticed, he ran. He ran from the city, ran from the house that had held him captive, ran from the life he had always known. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, freedom was waiting. Or so he thought. The journey was harder than he expected. He traveled by night, avoiding the main roads, stealing food where he could. Every Roman soldier, every merchant who passed him felt like a threat. He knew what would happen if he was caught. Runaway slaves were not given second chances. Some were branded. Some were beaten beyond recognition. Some were crucified. But Onesimus pushed forward, clutching the stolen silver in his pouch, his heart pounding every time he heard footsteps behind him. Finally, after weeks of running, he arrived in Rome, the great city of power and opportunity. But freedom was not what he expected. Rome was vast, too vast. Onesimus had thought he would disappear into the crowds, that he could make a life for himself far from Colossae. But the streets were dangerous, filled with men who would sell you out for a few coins. And the silver he had taken, it was almost gone. He found himself sleeping in alleyways, scrounging for food in the marketplaces, avoiding the watchful eyes of Roman guards. This was not freedom. This was another kind of prison. And then, one night, hungry and desperate, he heard a name. Paul, a preacher, a prisoner, a man who welcomed all. Onesimus's heart pounded. Was this the same Paul Philemon had spoken of? Could he help him? Or was it too late? Taking a shaky breath, Onesimus made a decision. He would find Paul. And maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change forever. Onesimus pulled his cloak tighter around himself as he made his way through the bustling streets of Rome. The city was alive with merchants shouting prices, the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread filling the air, and Roman soldiers patrolling every corner. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. He was still a fugitive. If anyone knew he was a runaway slave, if anyone recognized him, it would be the end of him. But the name Paul echoed in his mind over and over. This was the man Philemon had spoken of, the one who preached about a God who saw slaves and masters as equals, who claimed that no man was truly free without him. Paul was in prison now, but that didn't stop people from seeking him out. His name was whispered in the streets, spoken of in quiet corners, And the more Onesimus listened, the more he realized something strange. People didn't speak of Paul as a captive. They spoke of him as a man who was free. It took days before Onesimus finally gathered enough courage to ask about Paul's whereabouts. He found himself standing outside a heavy iron door guarded by 2 Roman soldiers. A woman named Prisca had led him here, her voice kind but firm. "You have nothing to fear," she assured him. "Paul welcomes all who seek the truth." Onesimus hesitated. Would Paul know what he had done? Would he see him for what he was, a runaway, a thief, a man who had turned his back on his master? Prisca knocked on the door, and after a moment, a voice from inside called, "Let him in!" Onesimus swallowed hard, his heart racing as he stepped through the threshold. The room was dimly lit, a small oil lamp casting flickering shadows on the walls. Chains rattled softly, and Onesimus's eyes landed on the man sitting in the center of the room, Paul. He was older than Onesimus expected, his hair lined with silver, his hands worn from years of labor and hardship. His wrists were bound in chains, yet his expression was peaceful. He did not look like a prisoner. He looked like a man who had already won. Paul studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You have come a long way," he said. Onesimus's throat tightened. "How do you know?" Paul's lips curved into a small smile. "Because I see it in your eyes. You are running. But the question is, what are you running from?" Onesimus looked away. Everything inside him wanted to turn back, to leave and disappear into the streets again. But where would he go? He had nowhere left. His fingers curled into fists. "I am a slave," he admitted, "or at least I was." He hesitated before continuing. "I ran from my master. I stole from him. I came here hoping to start over, but—" Paul nodded, waiting. Onesimus exhaled sharply. "But I am still a slave, even now." Silence filled the room. Then Paul leaned forward, his eyes filled with something Onesimus had never seen before: understanding. "You believe chains make a man a slave," Paul said. He lifted his wrists slightly, showing the iron shackles that bound him. "Then tell me, Onesimus, am I a slave?" Onesimus's brow furrowed. "You are in prison. You are chained." Paul chuckled softly. "Yes, my body is in chains, but my soul is free." Onesimus frowned. How can a man in chains be free? Paul's gaze did not waver. "Because I belong to Christ." Onesimus felt something shift inside him, something he did not yet understand. "Sit," Paul said gently. "Let me tell you of a freedom greater than the one you seek." And so Onesimus sat and listened, and, for the first time in his life, he felt hope. The dim light of the oil lamp flickered as Paul leaned forward, his eyes steady and filled with something Onesimus had never encountered before: peace. Not the kind of peace that came with having wealth or power, not the kind that came with escape or safety. It was something deeper, something Onesimus had spent his whole life searching for. "You ran because you believed that freedom was found in distance," Paul said, his voice calm. "But tell me, Onesimus, now that you are here, are you truly free?" Onesimus shifted uncomfortably, looking at his hands. "I'm not in Philemon's house anymore," he muttered. "I don't have to serve him. I don't have to obey him. I don't belong to anyone." Paul studied him. "And yet, you are still running." Onesimus's jaw tightened. Because if they find out what I've done, they'll take me back. They'll punish me. Or worse. Paul nodded, understanding. So, you are free, and yet you are afraid. Onesimus exhaled sharply. Wouldn't you be? Paul smiled faintly. I have been beaten, shipwrecked, and put in chains for what I believe. And yet, I fear nothing, because I know whom I belong to. Onesimus frowned. You mean this? Jesus? Paul nodded. Yes, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the one who gives true freedom. Onesimus crossed his arms. I've heard about him. Some say he performed miracles, healed the sick, even raised the dead. Paul's eyes gleamed. That is true. But he died, Onesimus pointed out. They crucified him like a criminal. Paul's face broke into a knowing smile. Yes, but 3 days later, he rose again. Onesimus blinked. That's impossible. Paul chuckled. Nothing is impossible for God. Silence stretched between them. Then Onesimus spoke, his voice lower. If that's true, if this Jesus really did all of that, what does that have to do with me? Paul leaned forward. Because you were bought with a price, Onesimus, just as I was, just as Philemon was. Onesimus stiffened. I am no longer Philemon's servant. Paul's eyes softened. Number. But you are still a slave to something. Onesimus swallowed hard. He didn't want to admit it, but Paul was right. He was a slave to fear, a slave to guilt, a slave to his past mistakes. Paul continued, his voice unwavering. Jesus came to set the captives free, not just those bound in chains, but those who are enslaved by sin. You can run from Philemon. You can run from Rome, but you cannot run from what is inside you. Only Christ can break those chains. Onesimus shook his head, rubbing his hands over his face. I don't understand. I thought freedom was just not belonging to anyone, making my own choices. Paul smiled. The world tells you that freedom is about control, but true freedom is about belonging. Not to a master of this world, but to the one who created you, to the one who sees you, not as a runaway, not as a thief, but as a beloved son. Something inside Onesimus cracked. A beloved son? A child of God? Could that truly be possible? For the next several days, Onesimus stayed with Paul, listening to his teachings, watching the way he spoke to others, how he treated those who came to visit him, even from inside a prison cell. And little by little, something changed inside Onesimus. The fear that had gripped his heart began to loosen. The guilt that had chained him to his past began to fade. For the first time, he was not looking over his shoulder. He was looking forward, and then, one evening, as he sat beside Paul, he finally whispered the words that had been stirring in his heart since the first day he arrived. I want to know him. Paul smiled. Then call upon his name. Onesimus swallowed hard, then closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he prayed. Jesus, he murmured, his voice unsteady. I don't know how to do this. I don't know what I'm supposed to say, but if you are who Paul says you are, if you really see me, if you really love me, then I don't want to run anymore. Tears burned in his eyes. I don't want to be a slave to my past. I don't want to be afraid. I want to be yours. Silence filled the room. Then, a peace, unlike anything he had ever known, washed over him. Onesimus inhaled sharply. His body still bore the marks of a runaway. His past was still stained with mistakes. But his soul felt clean. Paul placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are free, Onesimus. Not because you ran from your master, but because you have been redeemed by Christ." And Onesimus knew he would never be the same again. Days turned into weeks, and Onesimus stayed with Paul, learning more about Jesus, about faith, about what it meant to truly be free. He worked alongside the believers who came to visit Paul in prison, listened to their prayers, saw the way they cared for one another, how they spoke of God's kingdom as if it was more real than the world around them. And for the first time, Onesimus felt like he belonged. He wasn't just a fugitive anymore. He was a brother in Christ. But there was one thing that still troubled him. No matter how much he prayed, no matter how much he tried to push the thought away, he could not stop thinking about Philemon, the man he had run from, the man he had stolen from. His past still waited for him in Colossae. And then one evening, as Onesimus sat beside Paul, he finally spoke the words that had been burning in his heart. "I think I have to go back." Paul didn't look surprised. In fact, he nodded, as if he had known Onesimus would say this eventually. "It will not be easy," Paul said. "Returning means facing what you have done. It means placing yourself in Philemon's hands." Onesimus swallowed hard. "I know." "Are you ready for that?" Onesimus hesitated, fear curling inside him. He thought of the punishments waiting for runaway slaves. Philemon had every right to have him beaten, to sell him, to brand him as a thief. He could still lose everything. But then he thought of Jesus, the one who had already set him truly free, the one who had called him a son, not a slave. He took a slow breath and met Paul's gaze. "I'm ready." Paul took up a scroll and began writing, his hand moving steadily across the parchment. "If you are to return, you will not return alone," he said. "I will write to Philemon on your behalf." Onesimus frowned. "What will you say?" Paul glanced up, his eyes warm. "I will tell him the truth." The letter was short, but its words carried weight. Paul pleaded for Onesimus, not as a runaway, not as a thief, but as a brother in Christ. "I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whose father I became in my imprisonment. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he is indeed useful to you and to me. If he has wronged you at all, or owes you anything, charge that to my account. For perhaps this is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, not as a slave, but as a beloved brother." Paul sealed the letter and handed it to Onesimus. "You do not return as the same man who left," Paul said. "You go back not in fear, but in faith. Trust that God is already at work in Philemon's heart." Onesimus clutched the scroll tightly. "And if Philemon does not forgive me?" Paul's gaze was steady. "Then you will still be free, because your chains have already been broken." Onesimus exhaled, nodding slowly. He had once run toward freedom. Now he was walking back to it. The journey back to Colossae was long, and with every step, Onesimus's heart wrestled with doubt. Would Philemon welcome him? Would he cast him out? Would he punish him for what he had done? And yet each time fear tried to take hold, Onesimus remembered Paul's words. "You do not return alone." God was with him, and whatever happened next, he would trust in him. As the gates of Colossae came into view, Onesimus tightened his grip on the letter. It was time to face his past and step fully into his new future. Onesimus stood at the edge of Colossae, staring at the city that he had once fled under the cover of night. The streets were familiar. The scent of baking bread and burning oil filled the air, and the sound of merchants calling out their goods reached his ears. But everything felt different now, because he was different now. His heart pounded as he took slow steps toward Philemon's house, clutching Paul's letter tightly in his hand. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to turn around, to run the other way, to disappear back into the crowds of Rome. But he did not run this time, because he was not returning as a fugitive. He was returning as a brother in Christ. As he approached the large stone house, a familiar voice called out, "Onesimus?" He turned sharply to see one of Philemon's servants, a man who had worked alongside him for years. His eyes widened in shock. You're back?" Onesimus nodded, his throat dry. "I need to speak to Philemon." The servant hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the house. "He will not be pleased to see you." "I know," Onesimus said, gripping the letter tighter, "but I must see him anyway." The servant hesitated for only a moment longer before disappearing into the house. Onesimus took a deep breath. This was it. The doors swung open, and Philemon stepped into the courtyard. His expression was unreadable, his face tense, his jaw set. His eyes locked onto Onesimus, and for a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched. Then, "You have a lot of nerve coming back here," Philemon said, his voice low, controlled. "You stole from me. You abandoned your duties. You brought shame to my household." Onesimus swallowed hard. He had expected this. He deserved it. "I know," he said. "I wronged you, and I am ready to face whatever punishment you decide." Philemon stepped forward, his eyes burning with something deeper than anger, hurt, betrayal. "Then why did you return?" Onesimus slowly held out the letter. "Because Paul sent me back," he said, his voice steady. "And because I am not the man I used to be." Philemon took the scroll, his fingers tightening around the parchment. His eyes flicked to the seal of Paul, the apostle of Christ. He broke it open and began to read. As he did, the tension in his shoulders shifted, his brow furrowed, his breath caught. He read of Onesimus's transformation, of how he had given his life to Christ, of how he had served Paul with faith and humility, and of Paul's plea. "Perhaps this is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother." Philemon's hand trembled slightly. Onesimus waited. For a word, for a reaction, for judgment. Then Philemon lifted his eyes, and what Onesimus saw was not anger. It was something softer, something he never thought he would see. Philemon exhaled deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Paul speaks highly of you," he muttered. "He asks me to receive you as I would receive him." A pause. Then, "As my brother." The words hit Onesimus like a flood. He had prepared for punishment. He had braced himself for rejection. But forgiveness? He could barely breathe. Philemon studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You have changed, haven't you?" Onesimus nodded. "Yes." Silence stretched again before Philemon finally spoke. "Then so must I." He stepped forward, and for the first time since Onesimus had returned, Philemon reached out and embraced him. Onesimus stood frozen in Philemon's embrace, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. His master, the man he had stolen from, the man he had betrayed, the man he had feared returning to, had just called him brother. He had expected anger, he had expected punishment, but instead he had been met with grace. Philemon stepped back, studying Onesimus with an expression softer than before. "Paul calls you useful now," he murmured, tapping the letter in his hand. "And I believe him." The word struck deep. Useful. Once, Philemon had likely spoken that word of him in a different way, measuring his worth by his labor, by what he could produce. But this was different. Paul had written it with a new meaning, not as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. The other servants had gathered nearby, whispering among themselves, watching with wide eyes. They had expected to see a punishment. Instead, they had seen forgiveness. One of the older servants spoke up hesitantly. "Master, what does this mean? Will Onesimus still serve in the house?" Philemon's eyes never left Onesimus. "He will serve," Philemon said slowly, "but not as before." Onesimus tensed, waiting. Then Philemon smiled, a genuine, knowing smile. "He will serve as a brother, as a fellow worker in Christ, and he will stay if he chooses to." Onesimus felt his heart stop. Stay? As a free man? Philemon turned back to him, the weight of his decision clear in his voice. "Paul has asked me to send you back to him, to help him in his work, but I will not force you. You are no longer a slave under my authority. The choice is yours." The words sank in, deeper than any wound he had ever endured. He was free, truly free. Not because he had run away, not because he had hidden in Rome, but because of Christ. Onesimus took a long, deep breath, letting it settle inside him. He had spent so long running, so long searching for freedom, and now it had been given to him. But he knew now, freedom was not just escape. Freedom was belonging to Christ. And he had a choice to make. Would he stay with Philemon, serve in this house as a brother, prove himself to the man he had wronged? Or would he return to Paul, continue spreading the message that had changed his life? For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the weight of it all settle into his soul. Then he knew. He opened his eyes and looked at Philemon. "I want to go back to Paul," he said, his voice steady. "Not to run, not to hide, but to serve, to tell others what he told me." Philemon nodded, something proud and understanding in his eyes. "Then go," he said, "and tell Paul he was right about you." Onesimus swallowed hard. "And you?" Philemon gripped his shoulder. "You will always have a home here, Onesimus, but more than that, you will always have a place in the family of God." Onesimus exhaled, his chest lighter than it had ever been. He was leaving again. But this time, he was not running. He was walking in freedom. Onesimus returned to Paul, carrying Philemon's response, a letter of forgiveness, a letter of welcome, a letter of freedom. He did not return as a fugitive. He returned as a man redeemed. History tells us that Onesimus became a leader in the church, a man who carried the gospel with boldness, a living testimony of how Christ changes lives. And through Paul's letter, his story lived on. A story of grace, a story of forgiveness, a story of a man who was once a slave but who became so much more. Because in Christ, no one remains in chains, not to men, not to fear, not to sin. Because true freedom is found in Him alone.